Hey there. Tonight we're doing something a little different. A little morbid, even for us. We're stepping into the life of a grave robber in Victorian London. That's the pitch you clicked on. And it's not wrong, exactly. It's just early. Because the golden age of gothic tomb raiding you're picturing, with top hats and fog machines, that's not quite where we're going. We're going back a little further, to a decade before Victoria even had the crown, to London in the early 1830s, when the trade had a name that sounded almost respectable if you didn't think about it too hard. Resurrection men. That's what they called you. Not thieves. Not ghouls. Resurrection men, as though you were doing the corpses a favour. You weren't stealing jewellery. You weren't stealing silver combs off dead wrists or coins off dead eyes, though people did that too. And we'll get to why that particular crime was somehow worse in the eyes of the law than the crime you were actually committing. No, what you were stealing was the body itself, the whole depressing package. And someone, somewhere, in a nice clean lecture hall, was going to pay good money for it. Why would anyone pay for a corpse? Great question. Sit tight. We've got almost 2 hours, and by the end of it you'll understand the whole rotten economy, probably better than you wanted to. If you're enjoying this particular flavour of historical bleakness, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more of it, more true stories where the founding message is, yes, this really happened. And no, it did not get better before it got worse. And if you've got thoughts about resurrection men, anatomy schools, or the general Victorian disregard for anyone below a certain income bracket, drop them in the comments. I read them, mostly to remind myself that other people also find this stuff fascinating instead of horrifying. Now, dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe put a fan on for that low hum. The kind of sound that convinces your brain nothing bad is happening nearby. Let's begin. You are, for the record, nobody special. No name attached to this one, no face, because frankly it didn't matter then, and it doesn't matter now. You're just a body doing a job, which, considering the job, feels almost like foreshadowing. London, in 1831, is not the London of postcards. There are no postcards. There's coal smoke thick enough to chew, a river that smells like it's actively plotting against you, and streets so crowded with carts, animals, hawkers, and human desperation that walking anywhere feels like a minor military campaign. You live in a rented room, and when I say room, I'm being generous. Because what you've actually got is 4 damp walls, a straw mattress that's seen better decades, and a window that lets in exactly enough light to remind you it's daytime, which, some mornings, feels like an insult. You share the building with several other households, none of whom you know well, all of whom you can hear through the walls at unfortunate hours. The privy is shared, the water is questionable, and the whole structure smells faintly of boiled cabbage and unwashed ambition. This is not squalor by choice. This is squalor by economics. London in this period has swollen past 1 million people, packed into a city whose infrastructure was designed for roughly 1/10 of that number, and whose planning philosophy seems to have been figure it out. Work, when you can get it, is irregular. Maybe you're a labourer, hauling something heavy from one part of the city to another for a few pence. Maybe you do odd jobs at the docks, waiting in a crowd of other bodies each morning, hoping someone points at you instead of the person next to you. This is called, charmingly, casual labour, which is a polite way of saying you have no idea if you'll eat tomorrow. There's no contract, no schedule, no guarantee. Some weeks you work every day. Some weeks you stand around in the cold watching wealthier people walk past without looking at you, which, in its own way, is also a form of employment. If being invisible counts as a skill, it should. You're quite good at it. Food is a calculation, not a pleasure. Bread when you can afford it, and not the good kind. Maybe a bit of cheese if the week's been kind. Gin when you need to forget the week hasn't been kind. Which is often because gin in London at this point is cheaper than clean water, and infinitely more popular, for reasons that should be obvious to anyone who has ever had a bad day. The taverns are loud, crowded, and smoky, filled with people just like you, complaining about people, just like the people they're complaining to. It's less a social life than a support group that hasn't figured out. It's a support group. The markets are their own chaos. Smithfield for meat, reeking in ways that would end careers today. Covent Garden for produce, loud with sellers shouting prices like it's a competitive sport. You navigate these places the way everyone navigates poverty in a big city. Quickly, cautiously, and with a firm grip on whatever few coins you're carrying. Because pickpockets in London have a reputation, and reputations, historically, tend to be earned. At night, if you're lucky enough to have work the next day, you sleep. If you're not, you probably don't, because worry doesn't care about your circadian rhythm. The streets outside are never fully quiet. There's always a cart somewhere, a drunk somewhere, a watchman calling out the hour in a voice that suggests he'd rather be anywhere else, which, frankly, is relatable. London doesn't sleep so much as it dozes irritably, one eye open, waiting for something to go wrong. This is your normal. This is the baseline of misery against which everything else in this story is going to be measured. Keep that in mind, because in a moment someone's going to offer you a way out of some of it, and you're going to take it. Because that's what desperate, hungry people do when someone waves money at them. Nobody in this story is a hero. Nobody's a villain either. Everybody's just trying to eat. The offer doesn't come dramatically. There's no shadowy figure in an alley. No ominous music. Because this isn't a film. It's just London being London. It comes from someone you already sort of know. A fellow labourer maybe. Or an acquaintance from the tavern. Someone who's noticed you're reliable, quiet, and not particularly squeamish, which turns out to be the entire job description. They ask if you want to make some real money. Not tavern money. Not casual labour money. Actual, meaningful money. The kind that means you eat this week and the week after, and maybe you're not always one bad stretch away from starving. Naturally, you're interested. Poverty makes everyone a pragmatist eventually. The catch, when it comes quietly, almost as an afterthought, the way you'd mention the weather. The work involves cemeteries, at night, and it involves taking something out of the ground that wasn't there when it was buried. Let's pause here, because I imagine you have questions, and frankly, so did everyone who got this offer in real life. The first question is usually why. The second question is usually how much, which tells you a great deal about human priorities, and also about how effective hunger is as a moral solvent. Here's the why, and it's less sinister than you'd think, in the sense that nobody involved thought they were doing anything wrong, which is its own kind of horror, honestly. London in this period has medical schools, real ones, teaching real anatomy to real students who are going to go on to cut into real living people, presumably with some idea of what they're doing. To learn anatomy, you need to look inside a body, not a diagram, not a wax model, though those existed and were about as useful as you'd expect a candle sculpture to be for understanding how a kidney works. You need an actual human body, preferably one that hasn't been embalmed into leather, so that students can see what's actually in there before they start operating on someone who's still using theirs. The law, at this point, allowed for exactly one legal source of cadavers: the bodies of executed murderers. That's it. That's the entire legitimate supply chain. And executions, however Victorian London liked its public hangings as entertainment, weren't happening nearly often enough to meet demand. There were, by some estimates, several hundred anatomy students in London alone by the 1820s and 30s, all needing bodies to dissect, and the yearly number of executed criminals whose corpses were legally available for that purpose was nowhere close to sufficient. Basic arithmetic: meet basic supply and demand. Guess what happens when demand wildly outpaces legal supply? An illegal supply chain politely fills the gap. Because capitalism doesn't care about your ethical hang-ups, it just cares about the gap. So the surgeons and anatomy lecturers, respectable men with respectable reputations, needed bodies and couldn't legally get enough of them. And you, hungry and unbothered by cemeteries, were suddenly a solution to their problem. Nobody phrased it that crudely, of course. There were intermediaries, quiet arrangements, a kind of professional distance maintained by everyone involved, so that the surgeon never quite had to think about where the body on his table had spent the previous few days. And you never quite had to think about the fact that you were basically running a very grim delivery service. Here's a detail that should keep you up at night, if the rest of this hasn't already. Stealing a body, under English law at the time, existed in a strange legal grey zone, because a corpse itself wasn't considered property in the way a chair or a coin was property. This meant that digging one up and hauling it away wasn't ought in itself, always treated with the severity you'd expect. However, if you took the shroud, if you took a ring left on a finger, or a scrap of clothing buried with the body, that was theft, and theft of property had real teeth in the law. So the practical wisdom passed down among resurrection men was simple: leave the clothes, leave the trinkets, take only the body, and you were technically committing a lesser offence than if you'd walked off with a wedding ring. Let that sink in for a second. The law cared more about the ring than the person wearing it. Somewhere, a legislator should be very uncomfortable about that, posthumously. You take the job. Of course you take the job. You've done worse things for less money. And at least this doesn't involve heavy lifting during daylight. Though it does involve heavy lifting, just at a more sociable hour for crime. The days between the offer and your first night are strange, in that they don't feel strange at all. You go about your ordinary business. You eat your ordinary bread. You drink your ordinary gin in your ordinary tavern. Except now you find yourself listening a little more closely when someone mentions a death in the neighbourhood, a funeral, a burial scheduled for such and such day, at such and such churchyard. Funerals stop being occasions of sympathy and start being, quietly, in the back of your mind, opportunities. That's the moral cost nobody warns you about. It's not one dramatic decision. It's 1,000 small recalibrations of what a dead stranger means to you now. You learn, gradually, which cemeteries are worth watching. Poorer parishes tend to bury people in shallower graves, less because anyone's being lazy, and more because the ground's overcrowded and there's simply less room to dig deep, which, as an unintended side effect, makes your job considerably easier. You learn that fresh burials are what matter. Because anatomy schools want bodies before decomposition renders them useless for teaching, which gives you a narrow window, typically just a night or two after burial, before the goods, so to speak, spoil. You learn some cemeteries have watchhouses now, small stone or wooden structures built specifically so relatives or hired guards can sit through the night watching over a fresh grave, because families, understandably, are not thrilled about the prospect of Aunt So-and-so ending up on a dissection table 3 days after her funeral. Some families take turns keeping vigil themselves, sitting in the cold for nights on end out of grief and suspicion in roughly equal measure. Some wealthier families install iron cages called mortsafs directly over the grave, heavy metal contraptions bolted into the ground, specifically engineered to make your job miserable. Isn't that lovely? An entire cottage industry of anti-theft grave technology exists because of people exactly like you. You should feel free to feel a small, petty sense of professional pride about that. Somebody built an entire iron cage industry because you and people like you were good enough at this to be worth defending against. The night before your first job, you don't sleep well, which, given everything we've established about your usual sleep quality, is really saying something. You lie there in your damp little room, listening to the usual noises. A cart somewhere. A drunk somewhere. A watchman calling the hour, sounding, as ever, like a man deeply unenthusiastic about his career choices. You think about mud. You think about lanterns. You think with the specific dread of someone about to do something irreversible, about the exact moment you'll have to actually put a shovel into the ground. You're told what to bring, and the list is unglamorous in the extreme. A spade, ideally one without a metal edge that rings against stone, because sound carries strangely at night, and the last thing you want is a clang echoing across a silent churchyard, like a dinner bell for watchmen. A lantern, but not a bright one. Something you can shutter or dim in an instant. Because light is the enemy here. Light is the thing that gets you noticed. And getting noticed is the thing that gets you either arrested or worse. Sacking or canvas. Plain and unremarkable. The sort of thing nobody looks at twice, even if they do see you carrying it. Because apparently the trick to hauling stolen corpses through London is the same trick as hauling anything else through London. Look boring. Nobody stops the boring cart. You're also told, with the casual specificity of someone explaining a recipe, exactly how the digging works. Though we're going to be tasteful about the details here, because frankly you don't need them to fall asleep, and neither did the people who actually did this for a living, most of whom, if their occasional confessions and court testimonies are anything to go by, hated this part of the job more than any other part. You dig down toward the head end of the grave, not the full length of it, because that's faster. And speed at this point in the operation is not optional, it's survival. The whole business is meant to take under an hour, start to finish, digging to departure. Because every additional minute in a cemetery at night is a minute closer to someone noticing lantern light where lantern light has no business being. The night itself arrives, the way nights generally do, without fanfare, without a soundtrack, without any acknowledgement from the universe that this is supposedly a significant moment in your life. It's just Tuesday or Wednesday, cold, damp, unremarkable, the kind of London night where fog rolls up off the river and settles over everything, like it's trying to muffle the whole city into silence, which, weirdly, works in your favour. You meet your associates near the churchyard wall, a small group, maybe 2 or 3 of you total, because this isn't a job you do alone, not because you need help with the digging necessarily, but because you need a lookout. Someone whose entire job for the next hour is to stand very still and listen very hard for footsteps that shouldn't be there. You've drawn straws, metaphorically, over who digs and who watches. And tonight, let's say, digging duty falls to you. The wall itself isn't much of an obstacle. Cemetery walls in this period exist mostly as a suggestion, a polite architectural request that people not walk through consecrated ground uninvited, rather than an actual security measure. You go over it quietly, dropping into wet grass on the other side, and the churchyard opens up in front of you. Rows of stones pale in the moonlight, if there is moonlight, and if there isn't, just rows of slightly darker darkness against the general darkness, which is somehow worse, because your imagination fills in details your eyes can't provide. The smell here is different from the London you know. Less coal smoke, less unwashed crowd, more damp earth and old stone, and something underneath that you try very hard not to think about too specifically. You find the grave you're looking for, because you've already located it in daylight. During a perfectly normal, perfectly respectful walk through the churchyard that absolutely was not surveillance, even though it absolutely was. You stand there for a moment before you start. And this is the part nobody talks about, because it's not exciting. It's not cinematic. It's just you standing in the cold and the mud, spade in hand, having a brief, private, entirely practical crisis of conscience that you know isn't going to change your actions in the slightest. You think about who's under there. You think about the fact that somebody cried at this exact spot a day or two ago. That somebody stood exactly where you're standing now with a completely different purpose. And then you think about your rent and your empty larder, and the fact that thinking too hard about any of this has never once put bread on your table, and you start digging. Because that's the whole grim math of the job. Sentiment doesn't pay, and hunger doesn't negotiate. The ground is heavy with recent rain, and it clings to the spade in thick, uncooperative clumps, each one dragging at your arms like the earth itself has an opinion about what you're doing. Which, frankly, it might. Somewhere beyond the wall, London goes on being London, indifferent to your predicament. A church bell tolls the hour, muffled by fog, and you count the strikes without meaning to. The way anyone does when they're trying very hard to think about literally anything, except the thing they're currently doing. Your lookout stands somewhere behind you, silent, alert, straining to hear the specific sound of trouble, which in this context could mean a watchman's footsteps, a dog's bark, or, worse, the low murmur of a family member who decided tonight was the night to keep vigil after all. You dig anyway, slowly, carefully, quietly, one small increment of horrible progress at a time, while the fog presses in close and the lantern throws just enough dim light to work by, and not 1 inch more. And here's where we're going to leave you for now. Crouched in the mud, in the cold, in the dark, spade in hand, somewhere between the life you had this morning and the life you're about to have, with the whole absurd, miserable, oddly mundane business of resurrection still ahead of you. The bells have stopped, the fog hasn't, and somewhere in the city behind you, in a warm, well-lit room you'll never see, someone with a medical degree is waiting for a delivery. They'll never ask too many questions about. We'll pick it up there in a bit. For now, just rest in the mud with everyone else who's ever had a job. They didn't love, but couldn't afford to quit. The spade meets wood before it meets anything else, and that's the sound you've been half dreading and half listening for since you climbed over that wall. Not a crack, not a bang, just a dull, wet thud, wood on wood, adjacent earth. The kind of sound that means you're close, and also the kind of sound that means there's no pretending anymore that you're doing anything other than exactly what you're doing. You don't dig the whole grave. Nobody does. That's a myth, by the way, the full exhumation. 6 feet of earth thrown up in a dramatic arc, while thunder cracks somewhere behind you. Absolute nonsense. You dig down toward the head end only, a narrower hole than the coffin itself, because speed matters more than dignity, and because you're not trying to move furniture. You're trying to get in and out before anyone notices you exist. Efficiency, it turns out, is the one skill this job actually rewards. You clear the last few inches of dirt off the coffin lid with your hands now, not the spade, because metal on wood makes noise, and noise is currency you don't have to spend tonight. Your hands are freezing. Your hands have been freezing for the better part of an hour. Mud working its way under your nails in a way that will still be there 3 days from now, no matter how many times you scrub. A permanent little souvenir of the profession. Cold hands, wet wood. Damp canvas sack waiting behind you like it's patiently doing its job of being unremarkable. That's the whole toolkit. No pension. No apprenticeship papers. No guild. Just you. A shovel, and the profound personal willingness to disturb something most people consider sacred, permanent, and finished. You pry the lid. Coffins in this period, especially the ones belonging to people who weren't buried with money to spare, are not built to withstand much. A few nails, some thin wood, occasionally a lid that's practically decorative. It gives with a small, tired creak, the sound old furniture makes when you sit on it wrong, and for one absurd second your brain files that sound under furniture instead of under what it actually is, which tells you something about how the mind protects itself from doing a job like this without falling apart. You are not thinking about who this was. You are thinking about wood grain and hinge tension. Congratulations. You've discovered dissociation as a labor-saving device. What happens next, we're not going to walk through step by step, because frankly, you don't need the details to fall asleep, and neither did most of the men who actually did this, several of whom, according to their own later confessions, found this exact part of the job, the worst part, worse than the digging, worse than the fear, worse than getting caught, because this is the part where the abstract idea of resurrection work becomes a specific, physical, undeniable fact you're holding in your own 2 hands. There's rope, there's a hook sometimes, though hands and rope do most of the actual work. There's the sack, and there's you, working quickly, quietly, treating an unthinkable task with the same brisk, joyless competence you'd bring to hauling a sack of coal, because if you let yourself feel the full weight of what you're doing, you will freeze. And freezing here is not a metaphor. Freezing here gets you caught. You fill the hole back in. This part matters more than people think, and it's another detail that separates the professionals from the amateurs who got caught and ended up as a cautionary anecdote in someone else's memoir. You don't leave an open grave. An open grave is a scream in the dark, a flag planted directly over your crime that says, "Look here, everyone, something happened." You replace the soil, you press the turf back down, you make it look, as best you can in total darkness with cold hands and a racing pulse, like nothing occurred here at all. It's not perfect. It's never perfect. But it buys time, and time is the only currency more valuable than the money you're about to be paid. Somewhere out past the churchyard wall, a dog barks. Once, twice, then stops. You freeze completely, spade half raised, breath held so hard your chest aches, and you wait. 10 seconds. 20. Your lookout doesn't signal anything, which is the good kind of nothing. The kind of nothing that means the dog was barking at a cat, or the moon, or its own tail, or nothing at all. Dogs being fundamentally unserious creatures who bark at concepts. You exhale slowly, the fog swallowing the sound of it, and you go back to work. This will happen more than once tonight. It happens most nights. Your nervous system is going to spend the entirety of this new career operating at roughly 70% panic as a baseline, which, considering the alternative career options available to poor people in London at this exact moment, might still count as an upgrade. The lantern stays shuttered, except for the thinnest crack of light, just enough to see your own hands, not enough to be visible from more than a few feet away. You've learned to work almost entirely by feel and memory, which sounds impressive until you remember the alternative is getting arrested, at which point it becomes less impressive and more simply necessary. Somewhere, faint and directionless in the fog, a church bell tolls again, marking an hour you're too preoccupied to actually count. Bells in this city never stop. They mark the hours whether or not anyone's listening, indifferent to the fact that you, specifically, right now, would prefer they shut up. Eventually, it's done. The sack is heavier than you expected, and also somehow not heavy enough, in the sense that no amount of physical weight ever quite matches what you're actually carrying out of that churchyard. You sling it, you steady it, and you and your associates go back over that unimpressive little wall, the same way you came, quietly, quickly, with the specific silent efficiency of people who have collectively decided that talking about what just happened will not improve the situation. And now, the truly strange part of the night begins. You have to walk home. Or rather, not home, but towards somewhere, through a city that is, at this hour, doing an excellent impression of being completely uninvolved in your problems. London before dawn in this period exists in a kind of suspended state, half asleep, half working, entirely indifferent to whatever you're hauling through it. The gas lamps help you here, weirdly, because gaslighting has been creeping across London's streets since the 1810s, and by the 1830s, a fair number of the main thoroughfares are lit by these steady, hissing globes of blue-white light, which sounds like it should be a problem for someone in your line of work, and it is, sort of. Except gas lamps also mean predictable pools of light with predictable dark patches between them. And predictability is a gift when you're planning a route specifically designed to avoid being seen. You learn the gaps. You learn which streets have lamps every few dozen feet, and which ones still rely on the older oil lamps. Dimmer, more forgiving, or on nothing at all, which, depending on your mood, either terrifies you or feels like a small act of mercy from an uncaring city. You pass the occasional watchman, and this is where a little historical correction is useful, because your instinct, shaped by every Gothic engraving you've ever half-glanced at, is to picture some doddering old man with a lantern and a rattle, easily avoided, comically incompetent. That was true once under the old parish watch system, which was, by most contemporary accounts, chronically underfunded and staffed largely by men who'd rather be asleep. But by this exact stretch of the 1830s, London has the Metropolitan Police, established just a couple of years earlier in 1829, blue-coated, organised, patrolling in a way the old watch never managed. They are, mercifully for you, mostly focused on drunks, brawls, and property crime of the ordinary variety. And a person quietly walking with a sack over one shoulder in the dead of night is, statistically, less interesting to them than you'd think, provided you don't do anything to make yourself interesting, like running, or making eye contact for too long, or, obviously, letting anything visibly human-shaped slip out of the sack, which would escalate your evening considerably. The taverns are shutting their doors around you as you move, spilling out the last stragglers, Men and women too drunk to walk in a straight line, arguing about nothing, laughing about nothing, gloriously, enviably unburdened by whatever you're carrying. You envy them for about 4 seconds, and then remember you'd trade places with them in an instant if it paid as well. Which it doesn't. Which is the entire reason you're here instead of there. The markets are starting to stir even at this hour. Because markets in London never really sleep so much as take a very short nap. Porters are already hauling crates toward Covent Garden, wheels grinding against cobblestones in a rhythm that's almost soothing if you let it be. And somewhere off towards Smithfield you can smell the beginnings of the day's meat trade setting up. A smell that, on any other night, you might find appetizing, and tonight, given your current cargo, you very much do not. The river announces itself before you ever see it, the Thames contributing its usual generous odour of mud, tar, sewage, and dead fish to the general atmosphere, a smell so consistent and so aggressive that Londoners of this era have simply stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing your own house smells. You walk along streets that hug close to the water, past warehouses and darkened shop fronts, your sack over one shoulder, your heart doing a slow, steady drumbeat of low-grade dread, and nobody at all, gives you a second look. That's the horrifying efficiency of this whole operation. You are not sneaking through the shadows in a cape. You are just another tired labourer moving something heavy through the streets at an unglamorous hour, which, structurally, is exactly what half of London is doing at any given moment. Camouflage, it turns out, isn't about hiding. It's about being boring enough that nobody bothers to ask what's in the bag. Eventually you arrive somewhere specific, and where that somewhere is depends on the arrangement. But let's say, for our purposes, it's a private anatomy school, one of several operating in London at this time, often clustered in areas like the Borough, south of the river, near the older teaching hospitals, though plenty operated elsewhere too, tucked into unremarkable buildings that gave absolutely no external indication of what happened inside them. You knock, quietly, a specific number of times, at a specific door, because this whole trade runs on small, private codes exactly like this, unwritten rules passed along the same informal channels that got you into this line of work in the first place. Someone opens the door, not the lecturer. Never the lecturer, not at this stage. It's usually a porter, or an assistant, someone whose entire professional existence revolves around handling exactly this kind of delivery, without ever having to think too hard about where it came from. This is one of the great unspoken mechanisms of the whole operation. Everyone maintains a very convenient, very deliberate ignorance. You don't ask what happens to the body once it's inside. They don't ask which churchyard you visited tonight. Everybody gets to sleep slightly better, morally speaking, by simply refusing to complete the sentence in their own head. Inside, the smell changes immediately, and it's not the smell you'd expect. You might imagine decay, rot, something gothic and horrifying, and there's a hint of that, sure, underneath everything else. But mostly, what hits you is spirits of wine, sharp and chemical, used liberally both to preserve specimens and to mask the smell of the ones that can't be preserved for long. There's also, often, the smell of tobacco smoke, because plenty of anatomists and students smoked heavily while working, partly out of habit, and partly, one suspects, as a fairly practical form of odour management. Chloride of lime gets used too, a disinfecting powder with a sharp, almost bleach-like sting to it, scattered around dissecting rooms in an attempt to keep the whole enterprise from becoming completely unbearable. None of this fully works. It's less solving the smell, and more politely renegotiating with it. The room itself, if you get a glimpse of it, which you sometimes do and sometimes don't, depending on how businesslike tonight's transaction is contains long wooden tables, students' benches, shelves of instruments laid out with a precision that would almost be admirable if you weren't currently thinking about their intended use. And jars, plenty of jars, containing specimens preserved for teaching, in ways that make you deeply grateful you never had academic ambitions of your own. Payment happens quietly, efficiently, with the same institutional discretion as everything else in this building. Rates vary by season, and this is a genuinely fascinating, genuinely grim little economic detail. Anatomy schools in London operated on a teaching calendar, roughly running from October through the following spring, meaning demand for bodies spiked hard during the season and dropped considerably over summer, when students went home and lecturers took a break from slicing people open for pedagogical purposes. A body delivered during peak season might fetch several guineas, sometimes as much as 8, 10, occasionally more for a particularly fresh or otherwise desirable specimen, while the exact same delivery in the dead of summer might barely be worth the walk. You are, in other words, working an industry with its own bizarre seasonal fluctuations, like a farmer, except instead of crops you're harvesting somebody's recently deceased neighbour, and instead of weather patterns dictating your income, it's an academic timetable set by men who've never once had to dig a hole at midnight in their lives. Nobody asks where the body came from. That's the arrangement, the whole unspoken architecture of the trade. The surgeon or lecturer receiving the delivery maintains a studied, professional incuriosity, because asking too many questions would require acknowledging, out loud, in his own respectable establishment, that the entire legitimate practice of anatomical education in this country is quietly propped up by an illegal supply chain staffed by people exactly like you. Better, from his perspective, to simply take the delivery, make the payment, and get back to preparing tomorrow's lecture, secure in the knowledge that he never technically asked, and you never technically told him. So nobody, technically, did anything wrong. It's a beautiful little arrangement, really. If you enjoy watching respectable institutions build entire systems around not looking directly at the thing they depend on, here's the legal backdrop worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why this whole grim economy exists in the first place. Since the middle of the previous century, under a law commonly known as the Murder Act, the only bodies legally available for anatomical dissection in England were those of executed murderers, whose corpses could be handed over specifically as an additional punishment, a kind of posthumous humiliation layered on top of the execution itself. The idea being that dissection was so degrading, so thoroughly denied the dignity of a proper burial, that the threat of it might deter people from committing murder in the first place. Whether that ever actually deterred anyone is debatable. What's not debatable is the math. There were nowhere near enough executed murderers each year to supply the growing number of medical students needing bodies to study. London alone had multiple teaching hospitals and private anatomy schools, all competing for a supply that legally amounted to, some years, barely a couple dozen bodies total, nationwide, while the demand ran into the hundreds. When legitimate supply is that catastrophically insufficient, the market does what markets always do. When polite legality fails to meet demand, it goes underground, gets efficient, and finds people willing to do the work nobody wants their name attached to. That's you. That's the whole reason you exist in this story. And here's the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. More than the mud, more than the fog, more than the cold, a human corpse, under English law at this time, generally wasn't classified as property in any ordinary legal sense. Nobody owned a body, the way they owned a coat or a coin, which meant that simply removing a body from a grave, on its own, often didn't carry the same weight of criminal charge you'd expect, legally landing somewhere in a hazy zone of misdemeanor, nuisance, indecency, disturbing the peace, rather than outright theft. But the shroud wrapped around that body, the coffin it was buried in, any ring or trinket left on it, those were property, belonging to the estate, and taking those carried real legal teeth. So, the practical wisdom, passed down through this entire grim trade like some horrible apprenticeship tradition, was simple. Take the body, leave everything else, because the law, in its infinite and baffling wisdom, cared considerably more about protecting a dead woman's wedding ring than protecting her actual body from ending up on a dissection table. Sit with that for a second. Somewhere, a judge signed off on that hierarchy of value. Nobody's asking him to explain himself. Nobody ever did. You collect your payment, whatever it is that night, and you leave the way you came, back out into a London that's a little further along toward morning now, the sky doing that particular grey-brown thing it does before proper dawn. Not light exactly, just less dark. The fog starting to thin at the edges, even as the smell of coal smoke thickens with the first fires being lit in 1,000 kitchens across the city. You walk home with money in your pocket, more money than a normal night's labour would have paid you, and a very specific, very private kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with your muscles. This becomes routine faster than you'd like to admit. That's the genuinely uncomfortable truth about most terrible jobs throughout history. The first time feels like the end of the world, and the 10th time feels like Tuesday. You develop habits. You develop preferences. Which cemeteries have looser soil, which have shorter walls, which parishes bury quickly after death, and which linger, giving bodies time to become less useful for teaching purposes. You start thinking about funerals, the way a butcher thinks about livestock, which is a sentence I genuinely wish I didn't have to write. But there it is. This is what the job does to you, slowly, without any single dramatic moment where you consciously decide to become this way. It just happens. The way calluses happen. The way any repeated unpleasant task eventually stops registering as unpleasant and starts registering as simply Tuesday's business. But London, to its very limited credit, doesn't just lie there and take this. People notice. Families notice. And slowly, unevenly, the city starts pushing back against you. Which means your job, already unpleasant, is about to become considerably more complicated. You start hearing about watch houses springing up near certain cemeteries, small purpose-built shelters where relatives or hired watchmen paid specifically for this purpose can sit through the cold hours after a burial keeping an eye on freshly turned earth. Some families take shifts themselves, sitting up through the night in grief and suspicion in roughly equal measure, wrapped in blankets, armed with nothing more than lanterns and stubbornness, determined that whatever peace their loved one is owed, it's not going to be interrupted by someone like you. There's something almost admirable about it, if you squint, this idea of grief converting itself into a security detail. There's also something deeply exhausting about it, from a professional standpoint, because it means the easy targets are disappearing, replaced by exactly the kind of complications that could get you arrested, or worse, caught by an angry mob who won't wait around for the Metropolitan Police to sort out the finer legal distinctions between grave robbery and grand larceny before doing something about you personally. Then there are the Mortsafs. And if you haven't heard the term, let me introduce you to one of history's more paranoid engineering achievements. Heavy iron cages, sometimes elaborate metal frameworks, bolted directly over a grave and sunk partially into the ground, specifically designed to make digging up a body a practical impossibility. or at least enough of a nightmare that you'll move on to an easier target. Wealthier families install these with a kind of grim determination, an entire cottage industry springing up around defending the dead from people exactly like you, complete with blacksmiths who presumably feel very strange about their new specialty. Some parishes go further still, building actual stone or iron-roofed vaults, watchtowers even, in a few documented cases, employing spring guns or man-traps rigged near graves. Mechanical devices meant to maim or kill anyone who disturbed the ground uninvited. Feel free to feel a small, petty flicker of professional pride about the fact that an entire defensive industry rose up specifically because people like you got too good at this. It's not much, as sources of pride go, but you take what you can get in this line of work. Rumours start moving through your circle too, the loose, informal network of other resurrection men, intermediaries, porters, and the occasional sympathetic sexton who looks the other way for a small consideration. Rumours about which cemeteries have gotten too dangerous. Rumours about a fellow tradesman caught last month over in another parish, dragged before a magistrate, or worse, caught by an actual crowd of angry locals who decided the courts were taking too long. Rumours, increasingly, about the possibility that you're not always as alone in these churchyards as you think you are. One particular night, a few months into this new routine of yours, you find yourself standing at the edge of a churchyard you've worked before, safely, quietly, without incident. Except tonight something feels different, in that vague, prickling way that has no logical basis, and yet has kept generations of criminals alive purely on instinct. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's the fog sitting differently, or a shift in the wind carrying sound in unfamiliar directions. Or maybe, and this is the thought you can't quite shake as you crouch there in the dark, spade in hand, maybe somebody is actually watching, patient, silent, waiting to see exactly how far you'll go before they act. You never find out that particular night whether the feeling meant anything, because you decide, for once, that discretion outweighs greed, and you leave without digging at all, walking home empty-handed, unpaid, and thoroughly unsettled. That's the trade now. Not the desperate novel horror of your first night, but something steadier, more mundane, and somehow, in its own way, more exhausting. A job you've gotten disturbingly good at, performed in a city that's gotten disturbingly good at trying to stop you, both sides settling into an uneasy, unspoken routine, like two exhausted animals circling each other, neither one quite willing to make the first decisive move. You go home. You count your earnings, or don't, depending on the night. You sleep, badly, the way you always do, while somewhere out there, in cemeteries all across London, other people are doing exactly what you're doing, and other families are sitting up through the cold with lanterns, waiting for people exactly like you. You get good at reading a funeral. Notice the way other people read the weather. 3 lines in a newspaper. A name, a date, a church, and your brain is already doing arithmetic nobody else in that coffee house is doing. How old was the deceased? What they died of, if it's mentioned? Because a body that went out slowly, wasting from some long illness, isn't worth nearly as much to a surgeon as a body that went out quick and clean. Where the family stands, financially, because a poor burial in a poor parish means a shallow grave, thin wood, and nobody with the money to hire a watchman. You've started thinking about death announcements, the way a butcher thinks about livestock prices. And if that sentence makes you a little sick to read, imagine how it feels to be the one thinking it. None of this information comes from newspapers alone, though. Newspapers are the least reliable part of your intelligence network, mostly useful for confirming what you already heard 3 days earlier from someone who actually matters. The real information moves through people, and the beautiful, horrifying thing about London is that everyone's poor enough to sell you a piece of it. Sextons, for one. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. A sexton digs graves for a living, keeps the parish burial register, and generally knows more about who's dying, when, and where they're going into the ground than the vicar does. Some of them take a bribe without blinking, because their wages are miserable, and their scruples, apparently, are negotiable at a price that works out to considerably less than you'd hope. A shilling here, a bit of gin there, and suddenly you know exactly which corner of which churchyard got a fresh addition last Tuesday, how deep it went in, and whether the family paid for anything sturdier than the cheapest available wood. Porters help too, particularly the ones who work funeral processions or move coffins for the undertaker, because they see the whole business up close. The weight of the box, the thinness of the wood, the general shabbiness or grandeur of the affair, all useful data if you know how to read it. And publicans, obviously, because publicans know everything. A tavern near a churchyard becomes, without anyone officially deciding it should, a sort of unofficial trading post for information nobody wants written down. You buy around, you ask a question that sounds idle, and somebody who buried a cousin last week tells you more than they realize they're telling you. None of this is romantic. Let's be clear about that. This isn't some elegant criminal underworld with secret handshakes and dramatic candlelit meetings. It's just poverty, talking to poverty, exchanging small scraps of information because everybody needs the extra coin and nobody's in a position to be picky about where it comes from. You're not infiltrating anything. You're just one more tired person in a city full of tired people, all of you quietly complicit in keeping each other fed. The weather matters more than you'd think, and this is one of those details that never makes it into the Gothic engravings. Because Gothic engravings don't care whether you're standing in freezing drizzle for 4 hours waiting for a lookout signal that may never come. Rain, weirdly, helps you. It masks sound, it keeps honest people indoors, and it makes watchmen lazier, less inclined to do their rounds properly when the alternative is standing dry somewhere else. But too much rain turns the ground into soup, makes digging slower, makes the whole operation take longer than you want it to, and every extra minute in that churchyard is a minute you didn't agree to when you signed up for a fast job with a fast payout. There's no signing up, obviously. Nobody signs anything. But you understand the arrangement well enough by now to have opinions about the weather, which is its own small tragedy, honestly, that your professional preferences now include moderate drizzle, ideally without wind. You've also become something of an amateur soil scientist, though nobody's handing out certificates for it. Clay ground holds together and drains badly, which sounds like a nightmare, and mostly is, but it also means walls, when there are walls, tend to be older, less reinforced, because clay's brutal on foundations, and nobody wants to keep repairing them. Sandy ground digs faster, which you'd think would make it the dream location, except sandy ground also collapses faster, which means your hole doesn't hold its shape, which means more noise, more effort, more chance that the whole thing goes sideways at exactly the wrong moment. You develop preferences. You start to have a favourite churchyard, in the same grim professional way. A bricklayer might have a favourite job site, purely on the basis of things like drainage and wall height, entirely detached from what's actually buried there. The payment math never stops running in the back of your head either. A constant low hum of risk assessment you never asked for and can't turn off. A fresh adult body in good condition, delivered during the teaching season, might bring you something in the range of several guineas, sometimes more, if the anatomist's desperate or the specimen's particularly useful, sometimes considerably less, if you're dealing with a buyer who knows you don't have another option that night and prices accordingly. Against that, you're weighing the height of the wall, the presence or absence of a watch house, whether the family struck you as the sort to sit up all night out of grief, or the sort to go home and sleep, because what's done is done. You're weighing the parish, because some parishes have gotten organised about this in ways that others haven't. Some vestries paying for patrols, others not bothering, because nobody's complained loudly enough yet. Every single job is a fresh negotiation between hunger and fear. And if you want a tidy metaphor for what poverty actually does to a person's decision-making, there it is, free of charge. And you keep going back to the same handful of intermediaries, because that's how any trade works, illegal or otherwise. You don't shop your product around to a new buyer every time. You build something that resembles, in the loosest possible sense, a professional relationship. The same porter answers the same door at the same private anatomy school, recognizes your knock, recognizes you, and the transaction happens with all the emotional warmth of two men settling a coal delivery. Occasionally you get sent elsewhere, if that school's had a good week and doesn't need more stock, which is a genuinely strange sentence to have to think. Stock. About a person who had a name and a family, and a life full of small, ordinary Tuesdays before you dug them up. But that's the language the trade runs on, quietly, underneath everything, and you've stopped flinching at it, which should probably worry you more than it does. Here's where it's worth pulling back the curtain a bit. Because the men on the receiving end of your deliveries live in a completely different world from you, and the contrast is, frankly, the most obscene part of this entire arrangement. Walk into a proper anatomy lecture hall, one of the more established ones, and you'd find something that looks almost civilized. Rows of wooden benches rising in a shallow curve toward a central table. Oil lamps, sometimes the newer gas fittings, if the institution's wealthy enough, throwing steady light across a room that smells, above everything else, of spirits of wine. That's the preserving agent of choice. Alcohol, in various strengths, used to keep specimens usable for longer than nature intended, and it has a sharp, clean, almost medicinal smell that cuts through everything else in the room, or tries to. Underneath it, if the ventilation's bad, which it often is, there's the thing the spirits of wine are fighting against, and no amount of chloride of lime, that harsh white disinfecting powder scattered liberally around dissecting rooms of this era, fully wins that fight. It just negotiates a temporary truce. Add tobacco smoke to the mix, because plenty of the students, and not a few of the lecturers, smoke through their work, a habit that's partly nerves, partly boredom, and partly, one suspects, a very practical form of odour management that nobody's willing to say out loud. Add wet wool, because it's London, because it's always slightly wet outside, and every coat hanging on every hook by the door is quietly steaming in the warmth of the room. Add ink, because there are ledgers, there are always ledgers, records of specimens received, fees paid out, lectures scheduled, because even an illegal supply chain generates paperwork somewhere along its length, and someone, somewhere, is dipping a pen and writing down a number that represents you, without ever writing down your name. The students themselves are, by and large, young men of some means, or at least enough means to afford lecture fees, textbooks, and the sort of leisurely, unhurried education that involves sitting on a bench taking notes while someone else does the actual dirty work of procurement. They complain sometimes about the quality of specimens, the smell, the tedium of long lectures, the early hours, blissfully unaware or blissfully uninterested in the fact that somewhere out past the edge of their polite academic world, someone spent last night standing in mud up to their ankles so that this morning's lesson could happen at all. The lecturer himself, a surgeon of some reputation, walks in wearing a coat that costs more than you'll earn in a month of good, steady grave robbing, and begins his lesson with the calm authority of a man who has never once had to worry about whether a dog barking in the distance means trouble. That's the arrangement, in its purest, most concentrated form. Respectability sits at the front of the room, in good light, in a warm coat, asking rhetorical questions of eager students. Necessity, meaning you, stands outside in the cold, in the mud, in clothes that never quite dry out, entirely unacknowledged. And if either side of that equation were forced to trade places for even one night, the entire system would collapse within a week. Neither side particularly wants to think about that, so neither side does. Now, the legal backdrop, because it's worth understanding properly why any of this bizarre economy exists in the first place, and because the actual law here is stranger and messier than most people assume. Since well before your time, under what's generally called the Murder Act, dating back to the mid-1700s, the only bodies that could be legally handed over for anatomical dissection were those of executed murderers, specifically as an additional punishment layered on top of the execution itself. The thinking, such as it was, held that denying a proper burial, and instead reducing a body to a teaching specimen, amounted to a further degradation. A punishment that continued past death, meant to deter would-be murderers who presumably cared as much about their corpse's fate as their own neck. Whether that theory deterred anybody is, at best, unproven. What's not in dispute, in many years, and by most contemporary accounts, is that the number of executed murderers available annually fell dramatically short of what medical schools across the country actually needed, sometimes by a difference of many multiples, depending on the source and the year in question. London alone, with its teaching hospitals and its private anatomy schools all competing for the same painfully thin legal supply, simply couldn't function on murderers alone, not even close. When legitimate supply that badly fails to meet demand, something always fills the gap. And what filled it, in practice, was you, and people like you, working in a legal grey area that deserves a bit of unpacking, because it's genuinely one of the strangest quirks in English law at this time. A human corpse, generally speaking, wasn't treated as property in the way a coat or a coin or a horse was property. Nobody owned a body outright, the way you'd own an object, which meant, in practice, that simply removing a body from a grave often didn't slot neatly into existing theft law, because you can't steal something the law doesn't recognize as belonging to anyone in the first place. That's not the same as saying it was legal. It absolutely wasn't. Courts had other tools, and prosecutors used them. Charges relating to the disturbance of a grave, to trespass, to public indecency, to breach of the peace. Occasionally assault, if things got physical with a watchman or a family member who caught you at it. And if things escalated into a crowd situation, riot as well, which carried its own serious penalties. So don't mistake the murkiness around body as property for anything resembling safety. You could still very much end up standing in front of a magistrate. And depending on the mood of the court, the parish, and the newspapers that week, that could go badly for you in any number of creative ways. Where the law got genuinely, almost comically precise, was around everything except the body itself. the shroud wrapped around a corpse, the coffin it was buried in. Any ring, any locket, any small personal item left with the deceased. Those were property, belonging to the estate, and taking those carried real, well-established theft charges with real, well-established penalties. So the practical wisdom passed down through this entire grim trade, the closest thing you had to an apprenticeship manual, boiled down to a single rule: take the body, leave everything else exactly where it lies. Strip nothing, pocket nothing. Not because you'd develop some sudden reverence for the dead's personal effects, but because English law, in a display of priorities that should trouble you more than it probably does at 3 a.m. with mud on your hands, cared measurably more about protecting a woman's wedding ring than protecting her body from ending up under a surgeon's knife. Somebody drew that line. Nobody's ever adequately explained it. You just work within it and try not to think about the metaphysics too hard, because thinking about the metaphysics too hard is how a person in your line of work ends up unemployable due to sheer existential paralysis. And London, despite the law's odd blind spots, does not sit quietly and let this happen to its dead. That much becomes clearer to you with every passing month. The watch houses multiply. Small brick or timber shelters, sometimes barely bigger than a sentry box, built right up against the churchyard wall, or tucked near the gate, where a hired watchman, or occasionally a rotating shift of relatives, can sit through the cold hours after a burial with a lantern, and, if they're smart, something warm to drink, and something heavy to hold. You've walked past enough of them now to recognize the particular quality of light that spills out of one, a thin, wavering glow that means somebody's awake in there. Awake and specifically thinking about you, even though they've never met you and wouldn't recognize your face in daylight. There's something almost unbearably intimate about that, being thought about so intensely by a stranger who hates you on principle. Some families skip the hired watchman entirely and do the sitting themselves, which is its own particular flavour of grim. You've heard about it more than seen it, because seeing it usually means you're already too close to abort cleanly. But the accounts move through the same tavern gossip network that feeds you everything else. A widowed spouse sitting through 3 straight nights of cold and rain by a fresh grave, wrapped in every blanket the household owns, armed with nothing more than a stick and pure, undiluted refusal to let this happen to their loved one. Whatever this specifically means to them, whether it's the theft of a body or simply the theft of peace. Grief, it turns out, makes excellent security staff. Exhausted, unpaid, occasionally hysterical security staff, but security staff nonetheless. Then there's the iron. Mortsafs, they're sometimes called. Heavy cage-like frameworks bolted directly over a grave, sunk partially into the earth, engineered specifically to make digging a practical nightmare, or at least enough of a deterrent that you'll quietly reconsider and move along to easier prospects elsewhere. Wealthier parishes and families install these with a grim, methodical determination. And there's an entire small industry now, blacksmiths, who found an unusual, and presumably conversationally awkward, new specialty in corpse defence hardware. A few parishes go further, building proper stone vaults with iron-reinforced doors, or watch towers with a clear line of sight over the whole burial ground. You've even heard, though this one always arrives second-hand and slightly embellished depending on who's telling it, of spring guns or man-traps rigged near certain graves, mechanical devices meant to maim anyone who disturbs the ground without permission. You don't know if that particular rumour's true in every case, but you've started giving suspiciously undisturbed-looking ground a wider berth than strictly necessary, because being wrong about that once is considerably worse than being cautious about it. 50 times for nothing. You start noticing all of this. Changes how you sleep. On the rare nights you're not working. Not dramatically. Nothing so tidy as nightmares, with a clear narrative arc. Just a general, low, persistent hum of alertness that follows you into bed and refuses to fully switch off. The same hum that used to belong exclusively to hunger, and now belongs to hunger's considerably more paranoid cousin. You wake at small sounds that mean nothing. You lie there doing math about which churchyard you'll try next, whether the parish has put up a watch house yet, whether that family you overheard talking in the tavern last week has hired someone to sit up. Sleep, when it comes shallow and short, which is its own quiet, unglamorous cost of this work that nobody accounts for in the payment you receive. Nobody's paying you for the sleep. You're just losing it. Gradually. The way you lose feeling in your fingers on the coldest nights, without ever quite noticing the exact moment it went. There are close calls, of course, though close call makes it sound more thrilling than it generally is in practice. One night, working a churchyard you'd scouted as reasonably safe, you and your lookout hear footsteps on the gravel path near the church door. Slow, unhurried, clearly not in a rush toward anything in particular, and you both go completely still, flattened against the shadow of the wall, waiting. It turns out to be nothing more sinister than the sexton himself, out for reasons of his own, possibly drink-related, possibly insomnia-related, shuffling along toward some errand that has nothing to do with you at all. He passes within perhaps 15 feet of where you're crouched, humming something tunelessly under his breath, and disappears back into the darkness without ever knowing how close he came to a conversation neither of you wanted to have. You don't dig that night. The moment's gone, the nerve's gone, and you climb back over the wall with nothing to show for the hours you spent freezing behind it, which happens more often than the job's reputation would have you believe. Most nights in this line of work end in exactly this kind of quiet, unremarkable disappointment. The dramatic near misses people love to imagine are, statistically, the minority experience. Mostly, you just get cold, wait, and go home having accomplished nothing, which is its own particular exhaustion, the specific fatigue of risk without reward. Another time, weeks later, a different churchyard. You're midway through the job when a dog starts up somewhere close. Not the distant, unbothered barking you've learned to tune out, but close, urgent. The kind of barking that means the animal's noticed something specific and intends to keep mentioning it until somebody comes to check. You and your lookout freeze, and this time a light does appear. A lantern moving behind a cottage window near the churchyard's edge. Someone stirring. Someone possibly about to investigate. You don't wait to find out. You gather what you've got, which isn't much yet, barely started, and you're over that wall faster than dignity generally allows. Walking briskly, not running, because running looks guilty and walking looks merely late, through streets still dark enough to swallow you whole. Nothing comes of it. No shout, no pursuit, no magistrate. Just your heart going harder than it should for the better part of an hour afterward, and a job unfinished, and the low, familiar disappointment of another night's risk, paying out in nothing but adrenaline you didn't ask for and can't spend. This is the texture of the work now, most nights. Not horror, not drama. Just a kind of grinding, procedural anxiety. The same low hum whether you succeed or fail. The same walk home either way. The same count of coins, or absence of coins waiting at the end of it. And then, Sometime toward the tail end of the decade's early years, word starts arriving from Scotland. And it arrives the way all the important information in your world arrives, sideways, through taverns and porters, and the occasional smudged newspaper passed hand to hand, until the print's nearly worn off the page. At first it's just a name, or two names really, William Burke and William Hare, mentioned in the kind of hushed, half-disbelieving tone people use when a piece of news feels too large and too wrong to say at normal volume. Edinburgh, apparently. Something about lodgers, something about a tenant who died and got sold, and nobody thought much of it at first because, well, that's simply what happens sometimes, isn't it? A body finds its way to an anatomist one way or another, and questions tend not to get asked too loudly on either end of that transaction. Except the story doesn't stop there, and as it filters south over the following weeks, gaining detail and horror in roughly equal measure, depending on who's retelling it, you start to understand that this isn't a story about grave robbing at all. This is a story about two men who looked at the market you've spent years quietly serving. The market for bodies. Fresh, useful, undamaged bodies. And asked themselves a question you have never once let yourself seriously entertain. Not for a single second. Not even in your most desperate, coin-starved moments. Why bother digging up the dead when you could simply make more of them? You hear the details the way everyone hears them, in fragments, over the rim of a tankard, from a porter who heard it from a printer, who read it off a broadsheet nailed up outside some coffee house. Lodgers who never left, an arrangement with a surgeon, or surgeons, who apparently didn't ask the kinds of questions that might have stopped this considerably sooner. A tally of victims that keeps climbing every time the story gets told again. Because that's what happens to a story this size. It grows, in the telling the way all the worst stories do. True details, and rumoured ones, tangling together until nobody's entirely sure anymore, where the fact ends and the horror story embellishment begins. What you do know, what settles into your stomach like a stone the moment the full shape of it becomes clear, is that these men weren't doing your job. They weren't out in the cold, digging through frozen earth on the strength of a tip from a sympathetic sexton. They didn't wait for death to happen naturally, and then simply, opportunistically, take advantage of it. They skipped the waiting entirely. They created the product themselves, and sold it to the exact same kind of respectable medical establishment that's been quietly buying from you for years. No questions asked, no names taken. The same institutional incuriosity that's kept your own conscience comfortably numbed for as long as you've been doing this. You feel something at hearing this that surprises you a little, given how thoroughly you assumed you'd made peace with the moral architecture of your own trade. Disgust, yes, immediate and physical. But underneath that, something closer to dread, because you already know, with the grim, practical certainty of someone who understands how frightened crowds behave, exactly what's going to happen next. The public, gathering this story in fragments same as you, absorbing it through the same taverns and broadsheets and half-informed conversations, is not going to draw a careful, measured legal distinction between a resurrection man and a murderer. Why would they? From where they're standing, both of you end up delivering the exact same product to the exact same kind of building. Both of you profit from a body ending up on a dissecting table. The method behind how that body became available is a distinction that requires patience, nuance, and a working knowledge of the difference between grave disturbance and murder. 3 things. A frightened, grieving public reliably does not have in abundant supply when the story reaching them is this ugly. You sit with your drink going flat in front of you, listening to the tavern's normal evening noise carry on around you. laughter somewhere near the fire, someone arguing about a horse. And you understand, with the particular cold clarity that arrives right before everything gets considerably worse, that whatever fragile, unspoken arrangement has existed between you and the city up to this point, the guarded graves, the watchhouses, the wary but survivable game you've been playing for years, that arrangement is about to change. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon, and not in your favour, because the word spreading through this city right now isn't just news anymore. It's a new kind of fear, and you have no idea yet just how much of it is about to land squarely on people who look, from a frightened distance, exactly like you. The details keep arriving in pieces, because that's how the worst news always arrives, never all at once, never in a way that lets you brace for it properly. You get it in installments, like a bad novel serialized by people who clearly hate you. Edinburgh, 1828. That's the year. If anyone in your life kept a calendar, which they don't, because calendars are for people with futures worth tracking. William Burke and William Hare, along with the women in their lives, Margaret Laird and Helen MacDougall, ran what you might generously call a lodging house, and what history would eventually call something considerably darker. 16 people. By the time anyone finished counting, though counting implies a precision that nobody involved seemed particularly interested in maintaining while it was happening. 16 people who checked into that lodging house and never checked back out. Sold instead to Dr. Robert Knox, a respected anatomist running one of Edinburgh's more prominent private schools. A man who apparently found 16 suspiciously well-preserved, suspiciously convenient corpses worth purchasing, without ever once asking the kind of question you'd think a trained physician might think to ask. Funny how respectability works. Funny how it lets a man look directly at something and simply decline to see it. The same way your buyers have been declining to see you for years now. Except Knox's blindness, it turns out, had a body count attached to it that yours never did. You want to sit with that distinction for a second because it matters, and because the crowd screaming outside Knox's house later wasn't particularly interested in sitting with anything. You dug up the already dead. These men manufactured fresh product on demand, using strangulation, using suffocation, using whatever method left the least obvious mark on a body destined for a dissecting table, where nobody was going to examine the corpse for signs of foul play. Because why would they? The whole system was built on nobody asking. That's the horror underneath the horror. It's not that Burke and Hare found a loophole. It's that the loophole was always there, wide enough to walk 16 people through. And it took 2 particularly ruthless men to notice it and act on it before anyone with actual power thought to close it. They got caught, eventually. The way these things generally end, not through some brilliant piece of detective work, but through sloppiness, through a body found in a position that raised questions. Even a system built on not asking questions couldn't entirely ignore. William Burke stood trial in the very city where he'd done the killing, and in a piece of legal manoeuvring that should offend your sense of justice roughly as much as it offended everyone's at the time. William Hare turned King's evidence, testified against his partner, and walked free. Not acquitted, not found innocent, simply never prosecuted, because the Crown wanted a conviction more than it wanted consistency, and Hare's testimony was worth more to them than Hare's punishment. He disappears from history shortly afterward, into rumour and myth, and occasional unverified sightings, which is its own kind of dark comedy, honestly, that the man who arguably orchestrated as much of this as Burke did simply walks off the historical stage and nobody ever definitively catches up with him again. Burke wasn't so lucky. He was hanged in Edinburgh in January of 1829, in front of a crowd that by most accounts numbered in the tens of thousands. People who'd travelled considerable distances for the privilege of watching this specific man's neck stop working. And then, because the universe apparently has a sense of humour darker than yours, his body was publicly dissected, in the interest of anatomical education, the same fate he'd engineered for 16 other people, delivered to him by the very legal system whose gaps he'd exploited. And if that doesn't strike you as a genuinely well-constructed piece of irony, you're simply not paying attention. His skeleton, if you're curious, still exists, still on display in an Edinburgh medical school to this day, which means Burke achieved a strange, unwanted, permanent kind of immortality that none of his victims got anywhere near. You hear all of this the way you hear everything, second-hand in taverns, off broadsheets passed hand to hand, until the ink smudged past legibility, and you feel the temperature of the city change around you in real time. This isn't abstract anymore. This isn't a rumour about something happening somewhere else, to someone else, in a trade adjacent to yours, but comfortably distinct from it. This is proof, delivered in the most horrifying way possible, that the line between resurrection man and murderer, the line you've spent years quietly insisting exists and matters, is a line the general public has absolutely no patience for maintaining. From where they're standing, and honestly, you can't entirely blame them for standing there. Both of you deliver a body to a surgeon. Both of you get paid for it. The distinction between digging one up and making one fresh requires a kind of legal literacy that a frightened crowd, freshly informed that their neighbours might be selling their relatives to science by way of a pillow over the face, is simply not equipped to maintain in that particular moment. Nuance is the first casualty of public terror. It always has been. It always will be. You'd know this even if you hadn't lived through it, but living through it does sharpen the point considerably. So the suspicion spreads, and it spreads the way suspicion always spreads in a crowded, frightened city, which is to say indiscriminately, landing on everyone who even faintly resembles the shape of the threat. Anatomy schools that had operated for years with a kind of quiet, tolerated respectability suddenly find themselves the subject of open hostility. Crowds gather outside buildings where lectures happen, not doing anything in particular, just standing there, watching, letting their presence say what nobody's quite ready to say out loud yet. Surgeons who once walked London streets with the unbothered confidence of men whose profession put them comfortably above suspicion, now find themselves flinching at rocks through windows, at graffiti, at the particular kind of silence that falls over a room when they walk into it. Dr. Knox himself, back in Edinburgh, becomes something close to a hunted man in his own city. His effigy burned, his practice effectively ruined, his reputation permanently attached to 16 deaths he didn't personally cause, but absolutely, unmistakably enabled through a willful, professional refusal to ask an obvious question. Whether that ruins him legally is beside the point. It ruins him socially, which, in a profession built on trust and reputation, amounts to roughly the same thing, just slower and without the dignity of an actual verdict. And you, meanwhile, are just trying to work. That's the part nobody tells you. Gets harder in exactly this way. You're not Burke. You're not here. You've never touched a living person with anything resembling harmful intent, and you'd like that on the record somewhere. Except there's no record. There's no court. There's nobody keeping score on your behalf. All that's actually changed, from a purely practical standpoint, is that every churchyard in London has suddenly gotten considerably more paranoid, considerably better funded when it comes to security, and considerably less forgiving of anyone caught anywhere near freshly disturbed earth after dark. Watch houses that were sporadic before become nearly standard. Families who might have gone home after a burial and trusted the ground to hold now sit up through the cold, on principle, on fear, on stories they've heard about Edinburgh that have absolutely nothing to do with you specifically, but everything to do with what you look like from a distance at 2 a.m. near a grave. Mobs form faster and angrier than they used to. A resurrection man caught in the act, once a matter for a magistrate and a modest fine, now risks something considerably closer to being torn apart by whatever crowd happens to assemble before the authorities arrive, because the authorities arriving slowly has always been one of London's more reliable features, and a frightened mob doesn't wait politely for due process when it's already decided what it thinks it's looking at. You feel this shift directly, in your own work, in ways that have nothing to do with philosophy, and everything to do with your continued ability to eat. Jobs that used to take a reasonably straightforward 2 or 3 hours now stretch longer, because you're being more careful, because every shadow reads as a threat, because the calculation you've been running in your head for years, weighing risk against payout, has just had its risk column revised sharply upward without any corresponding increase on the payout side. Buyers, meanwhile, get nervous too, because respectable men with respectable coats do not enjoy being associated, even distantly, even unfairly, with the word murder, and some of them start asking more questions than they used to, wanting more assurance about where exactly a given body came from, which is a genuinely strange kind of ethics to suddenly develop after years of asking nothing at all. But there it is. Fear makes everyone, on every side of a transaction, briefly and selectively principled. Parliament, for its part, does what Parliament generally does when a scandal gets loud enough and lasts long enough, which is take its time. Form committees. Listen to testimony from surgeons and anatomists who've suddenly discovered a passionate interest in reforming a system they've quietly benefited from for decades. And eventually, after enough public pressure and enough horrified newspaper coverage, produce a piece of legislation. It doesn't happen overnight. Burke swings in early 1829, and you spend the immediately immediately following watching the ground shift under your feet without any clear sense of where it's shifting to, still working, still digging, still delivering. Because a scandal in Edinburgh, however loud, doesn't actually stop London's medical schools from needing bodies, and needs, historically, tend to outlast outrage. But the pressure keeps building, keeps accumulating, fed by continued public horror, by ongoing incidents of resurrection, men caught and occasionally beaten half to death by furious crowds, by the simple, grinding embarrassment of a respectable profession being publicly associated, again and again, with grave robbing, and now, unavoidably, with murder. The result, finally, arrives in 1832, the Anatomy Act, and if you want to understand your entire trade's death sentence delivered in the dry, bloodless language Parliament specialises in, this is where you find it. Here's what it actually does. Stripped of the parliamentary language nobody outside Westminster was ever meant to enjoy reading, it creates a legal channel for medical schools to obtain bodies that doesn't rely on executed murderers, the old, hopelessly inadequate supply under the Murder Act, and doesn't rely on you either. Specifically, it allows the unclaimed bodies of people who die in workhouses, hospitals, and prisons, people with no family able or willing to claim them for burial, to be handed over for anatomical dissection instead. Poor law institutions, staffed by overworked officials managing more corpses than budgets, find themselves suddenly holding something valuable, something medical schools will pay for through entirely legal channels. With paperwork and licenses and inspectors, none of the cloak and dagger nonsense that's defined your entire working life. A body dies penniless and unclaimed in a workhouse infirmary on a Tuesday, and by the following week, it might be lying on a dissecting table in front of a room full of students, and the entire transaction happens in daylight, with a signature, with an official designated to receive objections from any surviving relative who steps forward in time, though in time is doing a great deal of quiet, unkind work in that sentence. Because plenty of families never even hear about a death quickly enough to object to anything. Sit with that for a moment, because it's worth sitting with. The act doesn't stop the poor from ending up on a surgeon's table. It never intended to. What it does is legalize taking them, provided nobody with money or standing objects loudly enough in the narrow window allowed. The rich, the connected, the properly mourned. They get their traditional burials, their watched graves, their family plots undisturbed by anyone's scalpel. The poor, the same people who've spent this entire trade providing you with tips about which graves to rob because they needed the extra shilling, become the raw material by an entirely different, entirely legal route. You almost want to laugh at it. Except laughing at it requires a kind of distance from your own economic position that you frankly don't have, because you're poor too. And if things had gone only slightly differently for you, you might have ended up supplying the trade from the other end of it, in a workhouse bed, instead of standing over one with a shovel. None of this happens instantly, and this is the part worth being honest about. Because tidy historical narratives love a clean break, one law, one date, one dramatic transition from old world to new, and reality almost never cooperates with that kind of storytelling. The act passes, but implementation is slow, uneven, tangled in bureaucracy. The way anything involving multiple institutions, workhouse administrators, hospital officials, licensing inspectors, medical schools, always ends up tangled. Some regions adapt quickly, others lag for years, still relying on old, informal, occasionally still illegal arrangements, because the new legal supply hasn't caught up with the actual demand yet. You keep working through this transition, watching your trade shrink in real time without ever quite disappearing entirely, which is its own particular kind of misery, being present for your own slow economic death, without the mercy of it happening quickly. The price for a body starts dropping, and this is the detail that actually lands hardest, harder than any of the legal or moral abstraction, because you understand price the way you've always understood price. Viscerally, immediately, in terms of whether you eat this week or don't. What used to bring several guineas on a good delivery starts bringing less, because buyers have options now they didn't have before. Legal options, cleaner options, options that don't carry the same risk of ending up implicated in a scandal that's still fresh enough in public memory to make everyone nervous. Why would a school risk a resurrection man's product with all its attendant legal and reputational danger, when a workhouse contract delivers something functionally identical with a stamped piece of paper instead of a shovel and a lookout? The math you've spent years running in your head, the endless calculation of risk against payout, simply stops making sense the way it used to, because the payout keeps shrinking while the risk, thanks to Edinburgh, thanks to angry crowds and better-funded watchhouses, keeps climbing. Your lodging doesn't get any warmer during this stretch. Funny how that works. The wallpaper's still peeling in the same corner it's been peeling in for years. The fire still eats coal faster than your coin allows, and hunger, your oldest and most reliable companion in this entire miserable trade, doesn't care one bit about parliamentary reform. It just wants feeding, on schedule, regardless of whether the historical forces reshaping your industry are moving in your favour or not. You start noticing funerals differently again. The way you did back when this all started. Except now, the calculation runs the other direction. You're not counting potential opportunities anymore. You're counting how few of them remain. How many families now have watchhouses you can't get past? How many parishes have simply gotten too well organised, too well funded, too thoroughly done with the entire resurrection economy to leave you anything worth the risk? And underneath all of it, quietly, persistently, is the same institutional silence that's defined this whole arrangement from the start. The anatomy schools, the surgeons, the lecturers in their good coats standing in front of rooms full of eager, well-fed students. They don't publicly thank you for years of quiet, dangerous supply. As that supply dries up around you, why would they? Acknowledging you was never part of the deal. Not when you were essential, and certainly not now that you're becoming obsolete. They simply pivot, smoothly, efficiently, toward their new legal arrangement, their workhouse contracts and hospital paperwork, and the entire apparatus that used to depend on people exactly like you standing in freezing mud at 2 a.m. quietly forgets that any of that ever happened, the same way it always quietly forgot, every single time, that you existed at all outside the narrow, transactional moment when a body changed hands in a doorway. You walk home some mornings now, later into the decade, past the same churchyards you used to study like a professional, and they look different to you, not because the graves have changed, but because your relationship to them has. You're not calculating anymore. There's nothing left worth calculating. The trade that kept you fed, however precariously, however wrong, is quietly, unglamorously dying around you, without a funeral of its own, without anyone to sit up through the cold nights and mourn it. And you have absolutely no idea yet what's supposed to fill the space it leaves behind. The sky over London does its usual thing, grey shading slowly into greyer, refusing to commit to anything as dramatic as a sunrise. And you keep walking, because that's the one skill this entire miserable decade has actually taught you properly. Whatever happens next, you keep walking. The next job that comes your way isn't really a job at all. It's a rumour of a job, second-hand, from a man who used to be reliable and now mostly just owes you money. A parish out past Whitechapel, he says. Thin watch, new sexton, might be worth a look. You go anyway, because habits don't care about arithmetic, and you spend 4 cold hours in a churchyard doing math that keeps coming out wrong. The grave's watched better than promised. The ground's harder than it should be for the season. And even if you got through it clean, you already know what waits on the other end, because the other end has been getting worse for months now. The buyer you used to deal with, the one with the good coat and the careful, unbothered manner, doesn't answer at the usual door anymore. Someone else does. Someone younger. Someone who looks at you like you're tracking mud into a room that's recently been swept clean of you and people like you. He's polite about it, which somehow makes it worse. Explains, almost apologetically, that the school's arrangements have changed. Regular supply now. Proper channels. Paperwork. Nobody has to burn afterward. He doesn't say, "We don't need men like you anymore," outright, because that would require him to actually look at you while he said it. And he's already halfway back through the door before he finishes the sentence he didn't quite commit to. You stand there in the cold a moment longer than the conversation requires, because some part of you is waiting for him to change his mind. And he doesn't. And you already knew he wouldn't. That's the shape the ending takes, in case you were hoping for something more dramatic. No mob, no magistrate, no dramatic final chase through fog-choked streets with a lantern swinging and a body over your shoulder, while church bells toll ominously in the background. Just a series of doors that used to open and now don't. A series of men who used to nod at you across a threshold and now find something urgent to attend to on the far side of the room. The trade doesn't end with a bang. It ends with you standing in doorways, a beat too long, waiting for a transaction that isn't coming. In a city that has quietly decided it has better sources now, and doesn't much care what happens to the worse ones. The math, which has been the only honest thing in your life for years, finally just refuses to work. A body that used to bring several guineas now brings, if you're lucky, if the buyer's desperate, if the moon's in some rare cooperative alignment, barely enough to cover what you spent surviving the week it took you to get it. Subtract the lookout's cut. Subtract the coach or cart if you needed one. Subtract the risk, which has never had a proper price tag, but has definitely gotten more expensive since Edinburgh, since watchhouses multiplied, since every parish suddenly discovered a passion for iron cages over their dead that they'd never once considered when the dead were merely dead, and not also a headline. What's left, some weeks, is less than you'd have made hauling crates at the docks for the same number of hours, minus the very real possibility of a beating from a crowd that's decided, correctly or not, that you're the reason their aunt didn't stay buried. So you start doing the thing you spent years training yourself not to think about, which is imagining an ordinary week. Docks, maybe. There's always work at the docks. Or there's always the promise of work, which amounts to the same thing if you show up early enough, and don't mind the foreman's memory being selective about who he hired yesterday. Hauling. Sorting fish at Billingsgate before the sun's properly up. Standing in a puddle of something you'd rather not identify. Breathing in an air that's 2 parts fish and 1 part river, and entirely unbothered by your dignity. Casual labour at the market, moving barrels, carrying what needs carrying, being paid in coins that don't require you to check whether anyone saw you walk out of a churchyard with a sack. It's not better work. Let's be honest about that. It's just work that doesn't require you to lie about what you did with your night, which turns out to matter more than you expected it to, once the alternative starts drying up around you. And underneath all of it, the way it's always been underneath everything in this city, sits the workhouse, patient, institutional, entirely unbothered by your feelings about it. You've walked past the one nearest your lodging more times than you'd like to count, and you know exactly what it is now, in ways you didn't fully appreciate before the Anatomy Act made its purpose horribly, bureaucratically clear. It's not just where the desperate go to avoid starving outright. It's where the desperate go to become, eventually, quietly, without ceremony, exactly the kind of unclaimed body that ends up on a table, not so different from the ones you used to deliver to. The poor supplying the anatomists, either way it turns out, just with different paperwork depending on whether they went in willingly or got dug up by someone like you. You'd almost call that funny if you had any energy left for finding things funny. Here's the part worth sitting with, quietly, without turning it into a sermon. Because nobody needs a sermon at this hour, and you're too tired to deliver one convincingly anyway. What you did all those years, digging in the dark, risking the mob, risking the magistrate, was illegal, and it was disrespectful to grief, and it was, by any reasonable measure, a violation of something people hold sacred. But what replaced you isn't cleaner in the way anyone likes to pretend. It's just legal. The poor who die alone in workhouse beds don't get dug up under cover of darkness by a man with a shovel and a nervous lookout. They get signed for. itemized. Delivered through the front door in daylight, with a form attached, because Parliament finally figured out that if you formalise the theft, it stops being theft and starts being policy. You stole from the dead who'd already been buried. The system just started taking the poor before they got the chance to be buried at all. Whether that's an improvement depends entirely on where you're standing when you ask the question, and you've been standing in enough doorways lately to have an opinion, though nobody's exactly lining up to hear it. You still have the shovel. It's leaned in the corner of your room, where it's always leaned. Handle worn smooth in the places your hands wore it. And you look at it some mornings, the way you might look at an old friend who's gotten a bit too dangerous to keep around. You haven't sold it. You're not sure why. Maybe some part of you thinks there's one more job left in it, one more churchyard, with a watch too thin and a family too tired to keep vigil. One more delivery that pays enough to matter. But the weeks keep passing, and the job never quite materializes. And the shovel just sits there gathering the same dust as everything else, in a room that's never once, in all your time in it, managed to get properly warm. Your lodging hasn't changed. The wallpaper's still peeling in that one corner that's apparently decided to peel forever. A slow, permanent surrender. Nobody's bothered fixing. The coal smoke still hangs low over the rooftops most mornings, thick enough to taste, mixing with whatever's drifting up off the Thames, which is its own particular flavour of unpleasant that London residents have simply agreed, collectively, to stop noticing. Your bedding's still thin. It's always been thin. Thin was the standard you were issued at birth, and thin remains the standard now. Years into a trade that promised, briefly, to be something more than that, and mostly delivered exactly the same amount of cold, with slightly better pay attached to it for a while. One morning, and it doesn't matter exactly which one, because by this point they've all started blurring into each other. The way exhausted, uncertain mornings do, you find yourself walking past the churchyard again. Not for work. There isn't any work left there worth the risk, and some deeper, more honest part of you has finally stopped pretending otherwise. You just walk past it, the way you might walk past any ordinary landmark on an ordinary route to somewhere else. Docks, market, wherever you're hoping today's labour might materialise. The graves sit there, undisturbed, the way graves are generally supposed to sit, which strikes you as an oddly foreign sight after years of viewing every fresh mound as a problem to be solved, rather than a place where somebody's grief is allowed to simply exist without your professional interference. The watch house near the gate still stands, though nobody's posted there this early, the cold apparently having negotiated a temporary truce with vigilance. Frost sits thin and pale across the older stones. Somewhere behind you, a cart rattles over cobbles, wheels loud in the particular silence that only exists in a city right before it fully wakes, and a church bell somewhere starts up its morning business, unhurried, indifferent, the same bell that's been marking your entire miserable decade, without once caring whether you were listening. The sky's doing what it always does at this hour, refusing outright to commit to sunrise, holding instead at that stubborn grey that feels less like dawn and more like the sky simply running out of the energy required for darkness. You stand there a moment, breath fogging in the cold, looking at ground you'll never dig again, not because you've had some grand moral reckoning, nothing that tidy, but because there's simply nothing left in it for you, and a trade with nothing left in it stops being a trade and starts being a memory you happen to still be standing inside of. Then you keep walking toward the docks, toward whatever thin, uncertain labour the day's got waiting, because that's still the one skill nobody's managed to take from you yet. You're poor. You're tired. You've done things you wouldn't want carved on a headstone, assuming anyone ever bothers carving one for you, which, given everything, feels genuinely unlikely. But you're upright, and you're breathing. And this particular grey morning, against absolutely no odds worth celebrating, has you walking toward it instead of under it. That's not a triumph. It's barely an accomplishment, but it's yours. And in a city built on quietly discarding people like you, the moment you stop being useful, simply still being here counts for something, even if nobody's around to hand you a medal for it. And that's where we'll leave you. Still walking, still breathing, still entirely, stubbornly alive, which is more than this particular decade owed you, and more than it gave most of the people you once dug up out of the cold London ground. If you're still awake, well, that's on you at this point, not the story. Get some rest. There's nothing left to dig tonight.